Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Ian Bruce and this is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore some of the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, we're going to be talking to Larry Lohmann from the Corner House in Britain and one of the world's leading experts on carbon markets and green capitalism. Carbon markets were held up as the great solution to climate change under the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. But a few years later, nobody seemed to think they worked, and there was little mention of them in the Paris Accord of 2015. But although the language is different, the Paris proposal does rely on a raft of market mechanisms to cut carbon emissions. So what is the future for green capitalism, and what does it mean for countries like Ecuador? Let's look first at this short video.
The so-called guardrail of 2 degrees Celsius.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries.
Cambiemos el sistema y en consecuencia comenzaremos a salvar el planeta del capitalismo. Tenemos que contribuir con la salvación de la vida en este planeta y la supervivencia de la especie humana en la Tierra, que está siendo amenazada. Uno de los más grandes problemas es los cambios climáticos. Y resulta que los grandes países no quieren comprometerse con un conjunto de medidas que se han estudiado para frenar el incremento de la temperatura del planeta, que está produciendo, entre otras cosas, bueno, la desaparición de grandes masas polares, producto de ¿qué? Del sistema capitalista y depredador. Eso debe ser uno de nuestros aportes, sobre todo nosotros que somos país petrolero, desarrollar fuentes alternativas de energía, la energía solar, la energía eólica, frenar el derroche de combustible, el derroche del agua, de los recursos naturales, cuidar la naturaleza, los bosques, la fauna, los ríos, los mares, la naturaleza, la Pachamama, la madre tierra.
Larry, thank you for coming in. You visited Ecuador quite a few times, and I want to relate this issue of market mechanisms to combat climate change to the situation here in Ecuador. But let's begin with the general picture. Carbon markets. Just very briefly, what are they and what's happened to them over the last decade or even longer?
Carbon markets are basically a system for trading rights to pollute, in particular rights to pollute with carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. I like to think about carbon markets as a way of dealing with the problem of regulation from the point of view of corporations. In fact, I'd like to say that carbon markets, like other forms of green capitalism, are basically a tactic of cannibalism, one of 3 kinds of cannibalism, which I think capital has adopted in order to deal with the collapse of certain compromises in the 20th century, which capital faced.
Explain that idea of cannibalism to us.
Well, I think there were 3 big compromises that capital made in the mid to late 20th century in order to keep going. One of the compromises involved the welfare state, high wages for workers in northern countries, cheap resources mined from southern countries, cheap labor in southern countries, and so forth. I mean, you could sum it up by saying it's a sort of welfare state kind of Fordist kind of compromise. And the second compromise was actually developmentalism, which started again after the Second World War. And the idea was, it was a bit nationalistic, national based. The idea was to sort of tamp down some of the revolutionary energies that arose when countries became independent of colonialism and so forth. And I think the third compromise that capital was able to make during that period, let's say the mid to late 20th century, was environmental regulation, which really got underway in the 1970s. And again, this was a sort of response to the fact that industrial capital was maxing out a lot of the environment that it was working with. It was using up, it was polluting too much, it was using up too many resources and so forth. So there was this movement to make a compromise, which turned out to be environmental regulation. In the United States, this started in the 70s. Some places it started a bit earlier, some places later. But this was sort of a third compromise. And what's happened with the capitalist crisis since the 1970s and neoliberalism is that capital has begun to cannibalize the materials that it used to construct these compromises. For example, the welfare state is becoming privatized. Different aspects of the health service, the post office, the railways, and so forth are becoming turned over to private capital in order to deal with the profit crisis. Of course, financialization is also another response to that. Developmentalism also has been in decline and is more or less obsolete now. It's being replaced by a much more streamlined, internationalized system of economics, which you might summarize by citing WTO's latest slogan, which is, we don't make things in Ecuador anymore. We don't make things in Japan. We make things in the world. Made in the world and this involves, of course, a lot of very rapid circulation, a lot of division of production between different countries, and it's this sort of streamlined maneuver that has replaced developmentalism. And what's happened with the third compromise, environmental regulation, in my view, is that it began to seem too expensive for business, for capital. So they said, okay, we either have to get rid of this, or we have to cannibalize it in some way. And to my mind, carbon trading and the other forms of green capitalism are just a way of making this regulation cheaper and more flexible for business. So what business has actually done with things like carbon trading is they've turned to a second form of extractivism. They've started to extract new kinds of nature in order to produce tokens of cheap regulation, which can be bought and sold, and the prices of which have tended to decline over time.
So actually those markets are in a way prior to at least a widespread awareness of the climate crisis, which is, I guess, comes more into this century, right?
Yeah, I mean the roots of green capitalism and of carbon markets and of biodiversity markets were laid somewhat before the great public awareness of climate change. Not too long before. I mean, for example, in the United States, there was a program to make regulation of pollutants cheaper in the 1990s, before the Kyoto Protocol, before the big carbon markets started. It was called the sulfur dioxide trading program. And the idea was that, okay, well, all of these 1970 forms of regulation where the government directly said you can only pollute so much sulfur dioxide were replaced by this form of trading, whereby different industrial installations, different parts of the country could find the cheapest place to pollute using the trading of these cheap pollution tokens. So that came a little bit before the climate crisis, and that was pioneered by a group of neoclassical economists starting in the 1960s already.
Right. But if we move up to sort of Kyoto set carbon markets, I suppose the European Union's emission trading system is maybe the biggest, or was, and the best known, as kind of the bedrock for tackling the climate crisis, right? But then it seems to have gone away, and everyone seems to think, oh no, they didn't work, it's all dead. So what's happening?
Well, it's very interesting, and it involves a lot of maneuvering and lobbying and frankly, trickery at the level of the international climate negotiations. For example, during most of the negotiations for the Kyoto Protocol, the market was not necessarily going to be a result. The carbon market was not necessarily going to be a result of that. But at the last minute, the United States said, okay, let's change the agreement. Right now we have an agreement, a sort of juridical agreement, whereby if you pollute too much, you're subject to penalties, you're subject to sanctions, and so forth. And the United States at the last minute, and I think they had planned this quite carefully, introduced this measure which seemed very small and subtle at the time. Said, okay, let's not have a juridical system, let's have a trading system. So instead of you being subject to sanctions, which says you're doing which would say you're doing something wrong if you're polluting too much greenhouse gases, it was replaced with a trading system which said you can pollute as much as you like as long as you buy these tokens of pollution rights from other sources. And if you have enough of those tokens which give you the right to pollute, fine, you can pollute as much as you like. And that was a big shift that happened actually literally at the last hours of the Kyoto Protocol, and that sort of set the stamp on the climate negotiations since. The European Union emissions trading scheme followed a few years later because this kind of trading was adopted at Kyoto, and other schemes have followed since around the world, California, China, Quebec, Turkey, and so forth.
But what are the problems with this kind of carbon market? I mean, both from the point of view of capital and from the point of view of the environment.
Well, from the point of view of capital, it's a sort of necessary maneuver of cannibalism to try to get rid of all this expensive environmental regulation and replace it with something cheaper. So what it's actually supposed to do, it's actually not really designed to deal with the climate crisis. It's not designed to deal with the environment at all. It's designed to deal with the problem of expensive environmental regulation, make it cheaper, make it more flexible, to allow you, if you're a corporation, to go on building on a site even though previous regulation would have forbidden you to build on it, to allow you, if you're a corporation, to go on polluting with massive amounts of carbon dioxide, which previously would have been prohibited, but now you can compromise. You can say, okay, well, let me buy the rights to pollute from some other country, some other place, and I can go on polluting. So basically, it's a mechanism of economy, of saving the costs for business of regulation, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the environment. It's based on previous environmental regulation, which had its own problems, but it's basically not a way of addressing the climate crisis at all. And I think the record of carbon trading, the record of the Kyoto Protocol, the record of the EU emissions trading scheme, the record so far of the Paris Agreement has shown us that as emissions continue to rise, as the climate crisis continues to get worse, the prices of polluting actually are going down. And this has happened with almost every single carbon trading scheme in the world. As soon as it's set up, and it's set up with low prices to begin with, very cheap pollution rights to begin with, but the prices tend to go down from there, and they've gone down very steeply, for example, with the EU emissions trading scheme. And that's what the scheme is about. It's succeeded very, very well in that sense. It's made polluting cheaper. But it hasn't done anything for the climate crisis. In fact, it's made the climate crisis worse. So
has the emphasis, since the Paris Accord, has the emphasis changed towards other kinds of market mechanisms?
No, it's still basically green capitalism, basically buying and selling the rights to pollute. The only difference with Paris is that because of all the resistance to carbon markets that sprang up from the late 1990s onwards, the negotiators and businesses and governments as well, especially northern country governments, grew very cautious about using the word market.
Right.
So they don't use the word market or trading explicitly in the Paris Agreement, and that's something they've learned politically.
So what do they talk about?
They talk about something called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. There's nothing
which is incomprehensible to any normal human being.
Incomprehensible, completely. And there's no word market in there, there's no word trading there. But what it means is that you can trade a certain kind of right to pollute with other countries
That's
if you want to.
That's kind of like clean development mechanisms? Is that the same kind of...
Yeah, the same kind of political evasion.
So what are those, the cutting edge clean development mechanisms, or whatever the language is, now? And how do they affect a country like Ecuador?
Well, I think a system like carbon trading, a system like green capitalism, systems like biodiversity trading are going to affect Ecuador if these systems continue. They'll affect Ecuador more or less the same way that extractivism has affected Ecuador. In fact, in my view, these green trading systems, this green capitalism, is more or less a second form of extractivism.
Explain that?
Well, I mean, the first form of extractivism, I think, is intensified in many ways since the capitalist crisis began in the late 20th century. I mean, you had all these attempts to cheapen labor in the north, to separate people from their land in the south so that they too could become cheap labor in order to ramp up production, in order to increase productivity. And of course, all that productivity required more raw materials. So you have all these new cheap laborers. You need something for them to work with to make the export products, like all of the export products that have been going out of, for example, China since the 1990s. And of course, that's one of the spurs to the sort of resurgent extractivism that you see in countries like Ecuador. I mean, everybody knows, you know, Chinese companies, Chinese government is very big in Ecuador in extractivism, and it's connected with this whole capitalist crisis problem. But now, of course, you have this other problem, which is capital is also trying to not only make raw materials cheaper, so they can be used by labor to make products, but they also need to make the regulation, the environmental safeguards that the governments institute cheaper. And that's where the green capitalism comes in. But how do you do this? Well, for example, you mentioned the clean development mechanism. That's a form of what they call offsetting, a very technical term. But it's basically a way of producing rights to pollute, rights to damage the environment, which can then be traded. Well, how do you make these rights to pollute? For example, if you're an electricity generating authority that uses lots of fossil fuels, but you don't want to stop using coal, what you do is you go to a country like Ecuador and you say, okay, you over there, you plant some trees to absorb my carbon dioxide. You sell me the rights to pollute with my electricity generating plant, and I'll give you some money. Not too much money, but a little bit money if you plant some trees which supposedly are absorbing my carbon dioxide.
And as often as not, they're likely to be trees that are completely inappropriate to the local environment, right?
Well, that's actually something that's happened in Ecuador itself. I mean, in the 1990s, I think it was the Dutch electricity generating authority came to the Paramo in order to plant exotic pine trees from, God knows where, on this naturally treeless landscape, which the local people, Quechua people in this case, had maintained very well and knew how to maintain. They understood the water system, they understood the system of controlled burning, they understood the agriculture, they understood. But the Dutch paid some money in order to have the rights to pollute produced by the exotic pine trees planted in the Paramo. It didn't work out very well because the exotic pine trees burned. And also it didn't work out very well because the local people were held responsible for this, as if they wanted to take care of these, exotic pine trees, as if they could take care of these pine trees from some other biome, some other ecosystem. So it didn't work out very well, and that's the sort of problem you see again and again in this market for rights to pollute. In Latin
America, one of the issues that's been, resisted a lot and promoted a lot is RED, the reduction of emissions from deforestation. Mm-hmm. How does that apply? I mean, is that just part of the same kind of mechanism, and how does that affect Ecuador, for example?
Yeah, exactly. It's the same kind of mechanism. I mean, RED, which is a form of producing rights to pollute from preserving forests or reforestation, it is being promoted heavily around the world. And the ambition ultimately is to connect it with carbon markets so that, if you're an industrial capitalist, you can buy extra rights to pollute from RED projects in countries like Ecuador. And the ground is being laid for this in many countries, including Ecuador, through various schemes of payments. They call it payments for ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are destined to be this new commodity to make regulation cheaper, to be bought and sold. So RED will affect Ecuador, or could affect Ecuador, depending on how the resistance goes, in more or less the same ways as we saw with the example of the Dutch power plant and the Paramo and the Quechua people.
When you say they're preparing the ground, how far has it actually got so far here?
Well, consultants and businesses and officials have fanned out throughout the existing good forests in the world, whether it's Southeast Asia or India or North America, South America, and they've found communities, sometimes in very remote areas, and they come to those communities and they say, hey, look, we have a new way that you can earn some money. All you have to do is preserve the forest, or maybe plant a few exotic trees to take down some carbon from the atmosphere, and you'll get payments. And you know, if you present it that way, it sounds sort of interesting. And usually it's not explained what this is for. Usually it's not explained that this form of extractivism is a form of using people's land in order to produce pollution permits for somebody in some other country and some other industry to continue polluting or to pollute even more so they can escape from the expensive regulation. So what this happens is, and this is, the consultants almost never mention this to the local people. They never mention, for example, that if you accept this money, you'll be producing the right to pollute, which will be used by a corporation, say in Oklahoma or California, which then pollutes its local indigenous community, or then pollutes its local fence line community. They don't mention that, but that's one of the intrinsic features of the market. It's a way of dividing people. It's a way of both extracting carbon, extracting what you might call tokens of ecological quality from a certain location, and using it to support industrial capital elsewhere. And of course, that's also supporting a certain kind of, the first kind of extraction. So you have this sort of double extraction going on. Okay, we have extraction, which is damaging the atmosphere. We have carbon dioxide being produced by industries, you know, throughout the industrialized countries, you know, and that supports one kind of extraction. You've got to extract coal, you've got to extract oil, you have to extract minerals, all of that. But in order to deal with the environmental problems caused by that, you institute a second form of extraction, which is to go to the Paramo, to go to the Amazon and say, okay, well, we're going to take possession, and this is strict property rights, possession of the ecological quality of your area, divide it into tokens, and use it to support the first kind of extraction. So it's a use of the second kind of extraction to produce a new commodity which supports the first kind of extraction. So you have a double extraction and a double sort of impact on local people in different parts of the world.
And I guess often those are particularly areas where property rights, or at least use rights, have been shared in the past. You know, the idea of chopping it up and establishing property rights over it is quite alien to the local communities, right?
Yeah, this is exactly one of the problems, one of the many problems that these kinds of trading systems face, is that, you know, if you want to buy and sell something, if you want to sell something in particular, you have to own it. So in order for, you know, a community here or a business here to be able to sell the rights to pollute to another business, they have to own those rights to pollute. What does that mean? You know, in the case of a forest, what that means is you own the rights to the carbon in that forest, and that's a kind of private property right. And yeah, this, as you say, this is very alien to a lot of local people, and at first it's very difficult to understand because it sounds very technical and ephemeral and stuff, and you know, sometimes local people just don't understand what you're talking about when you say, okay, well, we have the rights to the carbon in the forest, therefore you cannot go in there and gather firewood anymore, you cannot gather, you know, house construction materials anymore, because the carbon is ours and you're affecting our carbon. So this can be very...
So let's come at it from the other angle. What's the alternative to this raft of market mechanisms, green capitalism?
Well, I think, you know, there are alternatives that exist all around us. The problem is that capital or business does not recognize them as alternatives. They don't see them as alternatives. I mean, for example, when you talk about the climate crisis, the alternatives are already there in the form of, for example, peasant agriculture, small family agriculture, the indigenous control of their own forests, the indigenous means of preserving their forests, the indigenous resistance against the extraction of oil, the resistance against the extraction of coal. I mean, these are alternatives which are already there. But of course, for capital, these are not alternatives because they don't contribute to accumulation. In fact, they're a drag, they're a brake on accumulation. So capital sees, well, these are not alternatives. But oftentimes the local people will say, yeah, these are exactly the alternatives. These are the alternatives we need in order to fight climate change.
So what do we need to do? What needs to be done to make these alternatives viable?
I think the most important thing is simply political support for these kinds of movements who already have, you know, the alternatives to issues like the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and they know they have those alternatives, but the problem is they're being criminalized, they're being oppressed, they're being hounded, they're being expropriated, and so forth. So I think one of the most important things to do is to support, either directly or indirectly, the movements that are already there in order to combat climate change. I mean, I think Via Campesina, the sort of the Worldwide Peasant Network, they have a nice slogan, is that we're keeping the planet cool. We're dealing with climate change already, so, you know, why don't you support us instead of looking for, you know, strange, exotic alternatives that don't work. I mean, the other side of the coin is that what capital thinks of as alternatives is often what local communities do not think of as alternatives. I mean, you could take, you know, from the country I live in, Britain, you know, there's this supposed alternative. Okay, well, we'll use less coal in our electricity generating plants. What do we do now? Okay, well, we'll go and find some wood somewhere to use instead of the coal, and the wood will regrow so it won't be as bad as coal. And this has turned out to be a disaster. You know, the electricity generators in Europe have gone to France, and they decimated a lot of forests there. They've gone to the eastern part of the United States, and you know, a lot of the eastern forests in the U.S. look like Swiss cheese now because they're producing they're producing wood chips in order to be fed to the power plants in the UK. For capital, this is a great alternative. And, you know, maybe it'll only last 5 years, but who cares? This is a great alternative. But I mean, for the people who want to preserve those forests, especially the people who live in them, this is not an alternative.
Let me finish with a kind of a big question, because unfortunately we're running out of time. But I mean, is there an alternative within a market economy, within capitalism, if you like? Or are we faced with this kind of major dilemma that there is no solution within a market economy, and yet we've only got about 30 years to sort it out, or it's going to be too late for anything?
Yeah, I think the first priority is simply to support those movements that are putting a brake on this, you know, extractivism, on this second-order extractivism that's involved in green capitalism. And I mean, I think, you know, it's a little presumptuous to say, okay, well, I have a new system, a completely new system already made for you, which will, you know, replace capitalism. I think we have to you know, support what already exists and see what works, and push against this sort of rejuvenated extractivism on all sides, the rejuvenated exploitation of cheap labor, and put all these movements together. And whether
if we push hard enough in that direction, you think it's possible to actually get out of this crazy situation we seem to be within the next few decades?
Well, I think there's no choice, and I think there's a lot of encouraging signs that people are resisting. And I think one of the most encouraging signs is that the movements which are opposing the cheapening of labor, the cannibalization of the welfare state, are starting to get together more and more with the people who are opposing the cannibalization of the non-human world, you know, the forests and the water and the grasslands and so forth. And I think this is the way to go. Where it will lead is not, you know, politics is an uncertain business, but I think these are where the clear signs of hope lie.
And I think maybe in Ecuador, those signs of hope are, you know, with problems, but there's quite a lot going on in that direction, right?
Yeah, I mean, I personally would regard Ecuador as one of the global leaders in this kind of thinking. I mean, of course, there's lots of conflicts going on in Ecuador as anywhere else, but I think there's a lot of exciting political things going on in Ecuador, including the widespread opposition to all forms of extraction, and the very self-conscious, I think, understanding that what we're fighting here actually has to do with capital accumulation, and there's no way of not talking about capital accumulation. There's no way of not talking about, you know, the exploitation of labor if we're going to deal with these environmental issues like the climate crisis.
Larry, thank you so much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but super interesting. We've been talking to Larry Lohmann about from the Corner House in Britain about the future for green capitalism, its impact here in countries like Ecuador, and the alternatives. This is Interviews from Quito. I'm Ian Bruce. Thank you for watching. watching. Until next time.
Están sacando agua de las napas profundas para regar sojales que contaminan todo el agua que sacan. O sea, están sacándolo de reserva.
A veces no puede estar inocente o sem culpar. O por causa de veneno o hospital.
Durante el gobierno golpista de Federico Franco se aprobaron una serie de eventos transgénicos, se abrieron las fronteras al capital internacional y lo que Cartes está haciendo es una continuidad y una profundización de eso mismo.
Es ampliamente difundido hoy en todo el planeta que las guerras futuras van a ser por el agua, así como las guerras hasta hoy han sido por el petróleo.
Vamos a hacer una minga. Soy Piedad Córdoba, activista de derechos humanos, y a donde quiera que vaya voy siempre en busca de una causa justa. ¡Tus luchas son nuestras luchas! El acuífero Guaraní es un extraordinario reservorio de agua subterránea. Este acuífero es transfronterizo porque se desarrolla por debajo del territorio de 4 países sudamericanos: Argentina, Uruguay, Brasil y Paraguay. La denominación guaraní responde a que su extensión coincide aproximadamente con la gran nación guaraní que habitó en la región. Esta enorme cantidad de agua se presenta como un inabarcable tanque de almacenamiento que podría abastecer a la población mundial durante 200 años a una tasa de 100 litros por día por habitante. Lo cierto, lo preocupante, es que hay extracción indiscriminada, contaminación inescrupulosa y voracidad mundial por este reservorio de agua tan magnífico que guarda América del Sur.
Chino cueja te monte, oye purú ajina, hoy purú un empresario cuera, entonces que lo ayuda a cuera y que coabeja lo lucha coabe. Upea viroña pinuja, upea uma la mecanización. Hay gente que no hay al contra de la mecanización, sino solamente de los ojeros. Por lo menos más de 70% la aerotóxico oye purú more colonia. Oye purú arroyo, oye purú pozo, y que hoy de 1400 metros abajo el agua dulce, que está más cerca acá en Chinocue. Orero y un poco más zona baja, cuando cerro, ya upevi o sea la producía el arroyo, entonces umiamos hasta arubija, upeyo lado la contaminación, la uiguireje.
Bueno, nosotros, y yo diría nosotros en América Latina, muy poco sabemos qué es el acuífero guaraní y mucho menos que abarca 4 países.